Thank you so much. We're going to discuss today medicine and resistance behind enemy lines, the case of the Jewish partisans. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 created the circumstances that gave rise to the partisan movement. After a surprise German attack, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured and became POWs, but some fled into the forests. The dense forests, which spanned hundreds of miles, were topographically ideal conditions for guerrilla warfare. More than that, they were a separate universe where nature ruled, and escapees were forced to develop new strategies in order to survive. During the second half of 1942, the Soviet partisan movement became more substantial and organized. Weapons, supplies, commanders, and orders arrived from Moscow. This was also the time when Jews started breaking out of ghettos and escaping to the forests, mainly after violent actions had occurred and the Jews were sent to death camps. My presentation, which is based on a diverse set of primary sources and testimonies of former partisans, mostly from Lithuania and Belarus, focuses on the specific case of medicine behind enemy lines in the partisan forests. Medicine in such unique and out of the ordinary conditions required ingenuity and creativity on the part of the medical staff. Living in the forests exposed the partisans to unfamiliar diseases and other health hazards. Many partisans became sick upon arriving at the forest. Chaim Lazar recalled, "Most partisans fell sick in their first months in the forests. The poor nutrition, the damp and constant humidity, and the terrible sanitary conditions weakened people. There were many cases when poorly fitting shoes caused foot injuries, since we constantly walked through mud and the shoes would tear or rot. There were also people who wanted to rest and asked doctors to release them from partisan duties." The most common diseases among the Jewish partisans in the Lithuanian forests were scurvy, stomach infections, diarrhea, and mostly furunculosis, contagious skin abscess caused by infection, which affected even the strongest. The Jewish partisan health precautions in the bases included maintaining certain hygiene and sanitation standards, as much as their primitive conditions allowed. Their sanitation was in a severely poor state during their initial period in the forests. They lacked clean underwear, and soap was an expensive and rare commodity. Treating those illnesses and medicine in general, depending on the presence of a doctor or a nurse, as well as the scant medical supplies that were obtained in special operations, which were no less important than the military ones. Doctors and nurses were in demand in the partisan units and were highly respected. Russian partisan commanders, such as Fyodor Markov, who was active in the Naroch forest in Belarus, sought Jewish doctors and sent Jewish partisan liaisons back to the ghettos to bring doctors to the forests. Indeed, most of the medical staff in Markov's Naroch-based headquarters were Jewish. Some of those medical doctors who operated in the partisan forests did not even finish their medical studies, but became authoritative figures among the partisans. This was, for example, the case of Shlomo Sulka Gorfinkel, a medical student from Vilna who became the chief doctor in the Rudniki forest in Lithuania, and his wife Emma was a nurse. Sulka did not yet finish his medical studies, but worked at the Vilna Ghetto Hospital. Emma was a chemistry student before the war. They escaped to the nearby forest during the ghetto's liquidation and set up a makeshift clinic and treated the wounded and sick partisans. Dr. Gurfinkel even conducted surgeries on wounded partisans and managed to save their lives under severe conditions. The first clinic in Rudniki consisted of a bench at the front of a tent where they placed all the supplies they had confiscated from local villagers in the raid operations. At times, partisans also smuggled supplies from the Vilna ghetto with the assistance of emissaries. Gorfinkel hung a sign on the tent, Ambulatoria. After a while, a designated Zimlanka, a bunker dug into the ground, was built to serve as a medical clinic and was lined with a white parachute. It contained a table also covered in white parachute fabric, on which was placed a sterilization device for medical instruments. Parachute fabric was also used as bandages. They also had a first aid backpack for emergencies, as well as a hidden pit containing food and medicine for the wounded in case there was a manhunt in the forest and they were forced to abandon their hideouts. Emma Gorfinkel recalled in her testimony, "For a long time, Sulka was the only doctor in the forest. He would ride his horse, visiting all the Rudniki forest partisan units, as well as treating the Lithuanian farmers and liaisons in the villages. First, he demanded that we build a steam bathhouse and told all the partisans in the Jewish Rudniki base to use it regularly. Sulka also instructed us to keep the kitchen clean to prevent diseases." Sulka Gurfinkel even performed surgeries in the forest. For instance, when a bullet hit partisan Boria Penausov accidentally fired from his own rifle, the bullet pierced his finger, which had to be amputated. Emma Penausov, Boria's sister-in-law, recounted, "Sulka began treating him without anesthesia. I held my brother-in-law. He was in great pain. He was given vodka, but it did not help. It was infected and inflamed." Even though Sulka did not have any surgical instruments, he knew he could find such instruments in one of the nearby villages. That night, a group of partisans entered the village, took the instruments, and Sulka was able to perform the surgery. Although it was his first surgical procedure, the surgery was a success. In another case, Chaim Lazar's right hand was injured during an operation on April 21st, 1944, in which the partisans laid mines on train tracks. When Lazar placed one of the mines on the track, another partisan accidentally pulled the rope, which caused an explosion. Luckily, Lazar stood half a meter away from the mine, causing him to lose just his hand and not his life. In his testimony, Lazar spoke of what occurred after the explosion. "Naturally, I was the only lucid person there. Everyone was so embarrassed. They didn't know what to do. I always had an emergency bandage in my pocket." His friends dressed his hand with the bandage, and the group headed back to the base. "As we were walking, I only wanted two things: to smoke and to drink. I didn't have tobacco nor water. It was terrible, he recalled. When they arrived at the base, he was admitted to a Zimlanka that served as a hospital. Dr. Gurfinkel operated on Lazar's wounded hand with the help of Vasha, a young Russian surgeon who was also a student of medicine. The operation required amputing parts of the hand and was performed by candlelight without any anesthesia. The patient was given samogon, the homemade alcoholic drink, to ease his pain. Lazar was my grandfather, and we can see him here in Vilna after liberation with his hand bandaged. In early July 1944, Anatoly Tolka Krakovsky suffered from severe stomach aches. Dr. Moshe Feigenberg, who escaped the HKP, the Nazi forced labor camp for Jews in Vilnius, at the end of June, diagnosed him with appendicitis, which required urgent surgery. He collected forks and knives from the partisan kitchen, disinfected them in boiling water, and prepared them for surgery. However, at the final moment, he decided not to perform the procedure, and indeed Krakovsky healed on his own. Lithuanian winters were extremely harsh. The partisans suffered from the cold, and there were even cases of people freezing to death. Frost wounds were treated with Rivanol brought by liaisons from Vilnius, and the patient pain was managed with sleeping pills and luminol. In the fall of 1943, the Rudniki forests were hit by a storm, which local villagers claimed to have not seen the like of in 70 years. The partisans were helpless in the face of the raging forces of nature. I quote a survivor telling that the stormy night would resonate in their memories as one of the most striking experiences in the forest. The storm caused the tree to collapse on the base kitchen, completely destroying it and wounding 2 partisans. Zhenya Penausov went into shock when the collapsed tree hit her head, causing a deep cut in her skull and a cerebral congestion. The same tree also fell on Alexander Senya Rindyonsky, who fainted after his leg broke. We called for help, and many came to try and drag him from beneath the tree. He was unconscious. We gave him a cortisone shot. The 2 nurses, Emma Gorfinkel and Henka Uzgod, treated the wounded in total darkness. Sulka Gorfinkel was gone that night, riding his horse to treat local villagers. When he returned to the base, he continued to treat the injured. Rindyonsky had broken his leg and arm. Gorfinkel crafted a wooden device to set the fractured limb. Rindyonsky was in pain for several weeks, and Sulka would sit by his bed at night, making sure the cast stayed in its place. Eliyahu Pupko, Dr. Eliyahu Pupko, was a partisan serving as a doctor in the Lipchanska forest. In his testimony, he described the difficulties he faced as a doctor in the forest. The lack of supplies, medicine, and soap, as well as poor sanitation. With time, a hospital was built, which was in fact a Zimlanka with 6 beds. After a while, a public bathhouse was built for sanitation maintenance. Due to the lack of medical equipment, the regiment commander decided to rob a hospital in Kozłowszczyzna, located in the Belarusian Slonim district. 5 men took part in the mission and seized all hospital equipment, clothing, and medicine. Dr. Aaron Dolinsky, a doctor from Oshmiana ghetto, escaped to the Naliboki forest in Belarus and spoke in his testimony of his operations in a Zimlanka clinic, which contained a wooden table and a sofa. On his first working day, a line of about 50 partisans stood in front of his clinic. Many had gone through sleepless nights due to agonizing gum diseases caused by vitamin deficiency. All Dolinsky could do was extract aching teeth and treat them with gum ointment. Those procedures serve as yet another example of the need for improvisation, resourcefulness, and the ability to find creative solutions for this unfamiliar and odd lifestyle. In their attempt to maintain hygiene and prevent diseases, all partisans were ordered to wash their clothes. Since they lacked soap, they would boil their clothes in water with ashes and iron them with old irons taken from the surrounding villages. Their poor sanitation, combined with long and strenuous walks through moist and wet terrains, often resulted in festering ulcers on their calves and feet. They also suffered from massive amount of lice, which infested their bodies due to their poor hygiene conditions and lack of clean clothes. In his testimony, Chaim Besok, a partisan from Naroch Forest, said, "We were full of lice. We had lice of all sizes, eating and sucking our blood. We would walk and scratch. Scratching was a kind of sport, as was searching for lice." Stolka Krakowski also remembered the partisans' struggle with the lice and even referred to it as the partisans' second battlefront. Let me sum up. Studying the case of Jewish medicine in the partisan forests is part of the broader story of Jewish resistance against the Germans during World War II. It is a story of extraordinary human endurance that emerged from a broad spectrum of human qualities. Jewish partisan medical staff operated in various war zones during the Holocaust years, for example, in Yugoslavia and Slovakia. Among the Jews who joined partisan forces in Slovakia after the outbreak of the Slovak National Uprising in 1944, some medical doctors testify that being doctors was what saved their lives. Otherwise, they might have fell victim to anti-Semitic violent acts. Partisan doctors and nurses had to operate behind enemy lines and treat injured and wounded in a place where there was no proper infrastructure and no way to evacuate them. What I shared with you today is only a part of a bigger story that needs to be told. Thank you very much.